Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. It's always a pleasure hosting webinars at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Program Director, who is with us this afternoon, Professor Zara Ali. I'll also want to greet the president of the Pan-African Psychologists Union, Professor Seth Cooper. Also our journalist who's here with us, Miss Ferreira Isabel, and then we've got also Mr. Opa Ngwenya, who's also part of the panel this evening. Distinguished guest, staff, student of UKZN, ladies and gentlemen. It is with immense pleasure and deep gratitude that I extend a warm welcome to each and every one of you gathered virtually this afternoon or this evening. This webinar stands as a testament to the enduring partnership between ourselves, UKZN, and UMTAPO, a collaboration built on shared values and a commitment to meaningful discourse. Ms. Arun is here representing UMTAPO. Thanks again for the continuing partnership. Under the banner of the quest for true humanity in a polarized world, this webinar assumes a paramount importance in the current global landscape. We find ourselves amidst unprecedented levels of division and also discord, where the antidote to polarization lies not in echo chambers, but in robust dialogue and respectful exchange. As a center of learning and enlightenment, our university advocates for the rigorous scrutiny of ideas, fostering an environment where intellectual curiosity supersedes hostility. This webinar serves as a beacon of this ethos, offering a platform for introspection and dialogue, particularly as we approach a significant electoral a milestone in our country. Today, we are compelled to confront challenging questions and confront uncomfortable truths. Have we, as a society, realized Steve Biko's vision of true humanity? What will his impassioned voice contribute to the discourse of our times? Undoubtedly, Biko would champion a world characterized by empathy and justice, urging us to realize his vision in our lifetime. Furthermore, this webinar provides us with an invaluable opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to human rights. In upholding these universal principles, we acknowledge our interconnectedness and embrace the collective responsibility to safeguard the dignity and well-being of everyone. In closing, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to each and every one of you present this evening, and also for your unwavering support in our academic endeavors. Your engagement and particularly your participation will enrich our dialogue this evening and propel us towards a more enlightened future. So with those few words, I would like to welcome everyone, and also a warmest welcome to our esteemed panelists who are ready to engage in the robust discussions this evening. So thank you so much. Before we pass it over to our facilitator, Ms. Keketo, I would like to hand over to Koliswa to introduce our esteemed panelists. Thank you, Koliswa. Over to you.
Thank you, Norma, and good evening, everyone. My name is Koliswa Zulu. I've got a very simple task, and that is to introduce our first speaker, Professor Zara Ali. Professor Ali is an assistant professor of sociology at Rutgers University in New York and leads the Critical Studies of Iraq initiative that centers knowledge making from social scientists and feminists in Iraq. As a sociologist, her research explores the dynamics of women and gender, race and class, as well as social and political movements concerning Islam, the Middle East, and contexts of war and conflict with a focus on contemporary Iraq. Her interests lie in racial capitalism, post-coloniality, decolonial and transnational feminism, as well as critical knowledge production and epistemologies, especially about global and public sociology. Professor Ali is currently working on a new book, Uprisings and Political Imagination, that shifts the dominant lens of social theory in analyzing mass protests away from a binary approach of power or resistance by looking at the political from the point of view of life, space, violence, and emancipation. Over to you, Professor Ali.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the great introduction. Thank you for having me. I'm very grateful for the invitation. It's my first time actually connecting kind of directly with our university, with scholars and also activists and feminists in South Africa. So I'm speaking with you from New York City, actually. And my talk is very much about Palestine right now. And what I would like to talk about is to reflect on transnational solidarity, more specifically transnational feminist solidarity, its meaning, its significance in relation to the ongoing genocide in Gaza. And I want to try to tie it to knowledge making and to the quest for true humanity in a polarized or multipolar world. I also want to emphasize that I'm speaking from my position as a feminist scholar, a sociologist from Iraq, but based in what I call the heart of the US empire in New York City. So I think that this positionality is also informing how I frame what I'm going to talk about. And also I want to start with saying why it is so important for me to talk about Palestine. In the past few years, I launched an initiative, you mentioned it, the Critical Studies of Iraq initiative, which really aims at centering the scholarship of social scientists and feminist scholars in Iraq, and also very much the scholarship of social scientists based and feminists based in the Global South. I mean, this is why it's very meaningful for me also to speak with you today. And the initial idea for me was to take Iraq as a framework, and not as a case study, but very much as a framework to theorize from, and not only about, right? To theorize from Iraq as a place, as a space. And the idea is to focus and give visibility to the epistemologies and critical knowledge emerging from scholars and also from activists in Iraq today. And I've been working in the past 2 years with research and academic institutions, especially in Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, but also in other regions of Iraq. Also with activists, especially feminist group, because my work in the past decade has really focused on feminist activism following the US invasion and occupation of Iraq. And I've worked with a lot of feminist groups, and we are kind of asking ourselves very important questions such as, okay, what is critical knowledge making? Last May, we had a conference in Baghdad gathering sociologists, anthropologists, feminist scholars from all over Iraq. And we asked ourselves, what does it mean to theorize from Iraq and from the Global South? What is theory? What is research? And who is it for? Whose interest does it serve? And so we discussed epistemological questions about the social sciences, about women, gender, and feminist studies, and how to develop critical thinking and critical theory in Iraq and also transnationally. And today, I want to focus very much on the meaning of transnational for me. And of course, for me, for us in Iraq, it matters very much to talk about Palestine and to take also Palestine as a framework to think about the world, as a lens to see the world and to understand it, and also to shape our theoretical and political imagination about justice, about freedom, about emancipation. So thinking with and from places from like Iraq, like Palestine, is to ask fundamental questions about the systems of power that structure the contemporary world. It is also to ask fundamental questions about humanity itself. Where are we heading? What are we accepting? What are we aiming for? And in what kind of world do we want to live? And let's say that with Palestine, especially speaking from where I'm based, there is clarity. There is clarity when it comes to our colleagues, to our comrades, to academic and activist circles, even in spaces that we thought were supposedly anti-racist, intersectional, very in tune with the colonial theory. You realize that when it comes to Palestine, nothing is a given. That many of our colleagues, even some of the most critical thinkers that have inspired us, can turn into what I often call the all lives matter narrative, right? And it is very disappointing. It has been very disappointing to witness that in the past 6 months. It's hurtful, and it is a true reminder that feminist activism, feminist thinking, just like freedom, is a constant struggle. There's not a point where it's enough. We've reached enough. It's really a constant struggle. We always have to push further. We always have to push for to basically understand humanity in a way that is more encompassing and less homogeneous. So I want to share also a little bit about the way I reflect on the meaning of the transnational feminism, which is really the scholarship, the intellectual tradition that has really inspired me in my own feminist thinking and also as a sociologist as well. So what does it mean, transnational feminist struggle, transnational feminist solidarity for justice in Palestine and beyond? And maybe also, I want to say that maybe before we start taking an analytical tone, that is supposedly the tone of academia, right? I have to say that in a time of genocide, I really refuse the distant, disconnected academic discourse that, as feminists have argued over and over again, emotions are the first window, the first form of analysis. And that right now and since the past 6 months, just like when the US invaded Iraq in 2003, I struggle to be analytical. I struggle to be articulate, because what it feels right now is that in some way there is so much to say, but that at the same time, everything has been said. That the situation in Gaza is beyond words. Or I should say that only the words from the people of Gaza, from the people of Palestine right now, truly matter. There is so much analytical, political sciencey discussion, and there's a lot of policy tone in the discussion about Palestine right now in Gaza. We hear words such as negotiation, resolutions, and for me, it's very much all noise. And I'm saying that because as a woman from Iraq, I have seen my country and my people being talked about as a thing that happened. people in this settler colony that is the United States often say Iraq happened. Iraq, like Gaza, is talked about as the background of a conversation about something else. And this something else very often is US foreign policy. And that the everyday life, the subjectivities, the experiences of actually people living in Gaza, people living in Palestine, in Iraq, are missing. And there's also, and I think we need to really pay attention to the terminology right now. Words are so important because there is always a cover up in the use of certain terms, such as war. They say during the war, before the war, after the war, as if we are talking about equal adversaries. In 2003, the term war was very much hiding the term invasion and occupation. When people talk about the Iraq war, they are talking about an abstraction is a thing and hiding the fact that it was very much an invasion and occupation. And today, in relation to Palestine, the term war is really militantly and purposely used to hide the term genocide. And in this saturation of media propaganda, in the West in particular, based on lies and misinformation, just like in the early 2000s after 9/11, is really here to hide the apocalyptic reality of Gaza today, the devastation, the incommensurable, the unspeakable tragedy. Because yes, in Iraq and in Gaza, we have experienced the apocalypse, not only once, but time and time again. And really words, and this is where I see also the limit of academic discourses, words cannot contain the incommensurable reality of our losses. What are words after all? Just sounds that contain little fragments of our feelings. Sometimes I really feel only the poetic can really allow us to make sense of what is happening. And this is definitely a time of outrage, of action, of organizing at every level, of bearing witness and very much of amplifying the voices of people in Gaza, of Palestinians themselves. And as scholars, as feminists, again, I mean, based here, I'm talking from here, the settler colony that is funding, arming, facilitating, and enabling Israel's genocidal war. Of course, there is a lot we can do. I mean, South Africa is really leading us as I mean, the BDS campaign has really been framed in following the example of actually the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and it's something that we are as scholars, as activists, as feminists, very much pressuring our universities, our campuses, our places of work to do. There are so many things that we can still do. And I think that the first thing that we should absolutely continue doing, and it's part of, the quest for true humanity, is really to not look away, to listen to the people of Gaza and Palestine, to the children of Gaza who are informing us about what is happening, and answer them in some way through our intentions, through our actions, through our words, with all our hearts. And I think South Africa has been very inspiring in doing that. And it is one way, I think, to counter what, and there's a term that I like very much to use that a few feminists have been using in the past few months, what I would call the structural gaslighting of corporate Western media and hegemonic political discourse that will always center white tears, white suffering, and have us conflate the oppressed with the oppressors. Racism, white feminism, and homonationalism frame the hegemonic discourse. And when sometimes, and only as a result of Palestinians themselves or Iraqis themselves in 2003, taking charge of documenting and informing the world about what is happening, when sometimes it sees victims, it can only see it through the lens of women and children. In Iraq during the invasion, in Palestine today, and in particular in Gaza, men are not seen as victims. Men are by default considered as terrorist sympathizers. They are considered disposable, so easily erased to even be mentioned. And I think that one way to decolonize actually feminism, especially for white feminists based in Europe and in Northern America, is actually to put Arab men, Palestinian men, Iraqi men, Afghani men, Black men at the center of their political imagination as true feminist subjects. And of course, we should absolutely point out the massacres of women and children. I mean, especially now in a context of genocide, we realize that women and children are particularly, and as much as men, they are targeted as much as men, if not more. But I think it's about problematizing the frame in which it is mentioned and used, and the type of subjectivities and experiences that it allows to show, and those that it hides. It hides the fact that Palestinian men were never considered civilians, that for Israelis, for the Zionists, there are no civilians in Gaza. The targeting of children, of women, the maiming is a central feature of genocide, as well as the erasure of men. In Gaza in the past decade, people have been living in a context of infrastructural destruction, where basic infrastructures and services are lacking. And in my work on women and gender in Iraq, this is a very central theme, like the very destruction of infrastructures that make it possible to sustain life, to sustain modern living, and also to sustain a life lived in dignity. And in the context of Iraq, and I think very much in Palestine now, I've talked about how actually women, we should see women as infrastructures themselves, as the ones carrying the entire survival of the household, the society on their shoulders, while dealing with so much restrictions and challenges. And so in time, such as a time of genocide, of invasion, occupation, all the systems of power that structure a society are exacerbated to the extreme in contexts where the preservation of life itself, I'm not even talking about a good life, life itself is a struggle. We have also seen in Gaza how people and their bare bodies have turned into real infrastructures in the absence of any support. And it is really remarkable how the people of Gaza, in particular children, have been the ones documenting, interviewing, informing the world about what is happening. And I have realized how much most of the information I get about Gaza, I actually get it from social media, and I get it from children. So in this context where the people of Gaza have been abandoned, that they alone are facing the genocidal Israeli ongoing settler colonialism, centering and amplifying their stories, their voices, their subjectivities, their everyday survival, their afterlife, their memories, mourning them, naming them, is absolutely fundamental. So what does transnational feminism mean in a time of genocide? I think the trans really means, the trans, I always insist on the trans as opposed to international feminism. Because for me, actually, there is a refusal of the enter, because the enter, what I see in the enter is that it essentializes and it homogenizes categories such as nation and women. And the trans really mean a refusal of the neoliberal, the capitalist, the white, the middle class woman of the world, right? This very, this category that is extremely homogeneous and that we need to problematize. It says that we live in a world, yes, in a one world, un tout monde, like Edouard Glissant says, and that this tout monde, this one world, is structured by systems of power, such as racial, colonial, heteropatriarchal, capitalist, that some, mostly but not strictly, in the global north, benefit from these systems, and that some are victims of it, oppressed by it. It means that some live at the expense, on the shoulder, through the exploitation and oppression of others. More clearly, it means that here, and I'm talking from the US, in this settler colony in which I live, we need to insist on the relationship between racism, imperialism, and settler colonialism. And we need to remind people that Gaza, that Palestine, that Iraq, that Afghanistan, just like Vietnam, are present in the everyday life of people in the US, in its military-industrial complex, in its normalization of police violence, in anti-Black and anti-immigration racism, and in its neocolonial white feminism, and so many other aspects of its social, economic, and political life. And I've witnessed in the past few years all the debates on racial reckoning following the Black Lives Matter uprising. And I think it's very important that it is happening. And I think that it needs to be articulated with imperial reckoning and the recognition that the US exists and thrives at the expense and through the destruction of other countries and their people. And I have to say that as much that I'm absolutely thrilled about the solidarity movement for justice in Palestine, in the US, for example, it is remarkable that it's been 6 months that this movement has been continuing in university campuses and elsewhere. And I recognize actually the ways in which the movement is also the result of a coming together of different struggles. Like I can hear it in the streets of protest. I can hear it in my university campus, that different struggles, that the repertoire of activism used by indigenous people in the US, the Black Lives Matter movement, Pan-Africanist repertoire, transnational Blackness activism, is contributing to thinking and organizing around Palestine. And as an Iraqi, I've also learned so much from Palestinians mobilizing in Palestine and in the US on how to build an agenda, a discourse, a narrative of creating intersection with other movements for justice and freedom. And I think in the past 6 months, I mean, also in relation to South Africa, it has been very inspiring. But at the same time, I want to emphasize something, is that the trans also means, it also means challenging borders of nation, gender, and sexuality. And I want to say that I struggle very much with simplistic anti-imperialist slogans and agendas. And I want to think of a world where we, humans, are all truly connected, and in which, and that's very important for me as a feminist as well, in which the integrity of the body, its freedom, its dignity, of living a dignified life with all the structural and infrastructural dimensions that it requires, is at the center of our political and theoretical imagination. So that also means that our struggle for justice in Palestine refuses categorically, and for our quest for a true humanity, refuses categorically to align itself with fascist regimes and political forces in the region. As an Iraqi, I know what authoritarianism is about, and I know too well how most Arab regimes have instrumentalized Palestine, how the fascist political forces that are repressing and silencing movements for justice and freedom in Iraq, and my next book that you mentioned is very much about the 2019 massive uprising that happened in Iraq, led by young people and poor people and women. So all of these political forces that have been repressing and silencing movements such as the Iraqi uprising and also movements in the region, those are not my allies. They are an essential part of the problem. And I do think that, you know, it is important to state right now that, you know, standing with the people of Iran, of Iraq, of Syria, not with the regimes that kill them, silence them, and repress their uprising, no matter what they pretend to represent, or no matter how they express their opposition to US imperialism, is very important. So it is absolutely essential for us feminists to build spaces where we can collectively imagine the world we want to live in, not only the one that we are standing against. For that, I think it is essential to continue to put the experiences, the subjectivities, and the lives of those who are so easily erased and imprisoned in their precariousness, and to listen to the terms in which they are defining their oppression, even when it does not fall into the way we frame or define the political. I think we need more of these spaces right now. I will stop here. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much. I'm just struggling with my camera for a second. Just one sec for me. I'll try and figure out where my camera is. I'm so sorry, but my gadgets are just really giving me problems. But whilst we are trying to sort out the technology issues, I'd like to quickly go and whilst I'm trying to figure out my video, why it's not coming through, to introduce quickly Professor Seth Cooper, and to can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh,
Yes,
fantastic.
we can hear you.
I'm struggling a little bit with my camera, but I think there we go. It finally is working. Professor Sats Cooper is the president of the Pan-African Psychology Union and a stalwart of the Black Consciousness Movement, and was a close comrade of the late Steve Biko. He was elected as the publicity secretary of the Black People's Convention and its founding conference in 1973, and has been banned, house arrested, and jailed for 9 years, spending 6 years on Robben Island after his release in 1981. He joined the Azanian People's Organization, AZAPO, and served at different times as a vice president and president. He is graduate of the University of South Africa, Witwatersrand in Boston, where he obtained his PhD in clinical community psychology. He was the first Black chair of the Regulatory Professional Board for Psychology at the Health Professions Council of South Africa, and is also former vice chancellor of the University of Durban, Westville. He holds professorial appointments at the University of Pretoria and Stellenbosch, and is past president of the International Union of Psychological Science. My president, Comrade Sats Cooper, will be speaking to the same topic, and once he has finished, we will then also bring in Comrade Opa Ngwenya. And Comrade Opa is the founding Secretary General of the Forum of Black Journalists and a freelance writer and columnist and project coordinator of the 70s group. But before I go into Professor Sats Cooper and give him an opportunity, I just want to quickly just capture a few things that kind of hit the note for me with Professor Zara. And I just want us to keep at the top of mind how language is so disingenuous today. Sort of, activism language also lends itself as disingenuous, and how words are used to cover up certain things, and how today human rights are only of value to certain nations, but also how we need to reflect on how people, and particularly hegemonious, countries like the US, are profiteering at the abuse of people and the abuse of other people's rights, and how truly global systems continue to benefit from, denying other nations their sovereignty, their own human rights. But before we could go there, she also asked us to imagine a world that we want to live in. And she literally reminded me of a quote by Comrade Steve Biko, where he himself is talking about, and I quote, "We are set out on a quest for true humanity, and somewhere on the distant horizon, we can see the glittering prize. Let us march forth with our courage and determination, drawing strength from our common plight and our brotherhood and sisterhood, where in time we shall be in a position to bestow upon South Africa the great gift of a more human face." And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, could we together look towards bestowing the world with a more human face? Comrade President, Comrade Sats Cooper, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me start off by saying that all of us are biologically the same, save for reproduction and a few congenital conditions. But everywhere, difference is used to keep us apart from our own essential humanness. Euro-American ontology the dominance of their media, and Western capture of our education, indeed our socialization, has created the conditions for perennial conflict, lack of tolerance, and shared understanding of this, our common humanness. In this situation, we need to pause and ask, why is this so? Now, depending on one's background, depending on one's discipline, depending on one's belief system, you can have a welter of explanations for this. And I'll deal with that shortly. But I also want to point out that it is breathtakingly confounding to find that those who experienced the Holocaust would participate in and in real time share with us their destruction of lives and the flattening of the accoutrement of life. The last count I heard was 32,000 people killed. And in arguments, there's posited, there are still so many persons who are held hostage. That I want you to ponder, because for most of us on this platform, we know that our own lives have been cheapened and made almost an appendage of the privilege of those in economic, in social, and often in political power the world over. In psychology, there's enough research done to show that someone who's been abused can easily become an abuser. One can get groomed by thugs, by murderers, to commit those very acts. What is also quite remarkable is that victimhood from the Holocaust is born as a badge to resist any self-evaluation, to resist any notion that because my grandparents were victims of the Holocaust, it ipso facto, it's almost natural that I will never be that way. I'm reminded that there was an Anglo-Boer War in this country. I mean, the name has changed. It's called the Great War, something like that. But the first concentration camps for Boers, for mothers, elderly, and children, were built by the British in that war. Similar conditions that the Nazis picked up and used in concentration camps. So those concentration camps in Bloemfontein, some of them are still there, reflect how Boers felt oppressed by the British and needed to claim their space. So they called themselves, they arrogated unto themselves the name African. They call themselves Afrikaner. Afrikaner, and then it morphed into Afrikaner. Because we, therefore, the Afrikaners, are the owners and the rightful heirs to the land. The similarities with what's going on in occupied Palestine, from the Zionist unremitting assault, indiscriminate assault. And over the last 2 days, we've had certain food humanitarian groups there's apologies for some of them being killed, that these were mistakes, that it was friendly fire, and so on. Now, how does this happen that we can mourn somebody who brings the aid, but we don't mourn for little children being maimed, being killed in front of our eyes? That, I believe, comes from the grotesque othering of anybody who does not look like us, speak like us, and we create an objectification. I call it a process of reification, taken from the Latin word for thing, reus. What does happen is Euro-Americanism and melanin disadvantage gets highlighted as a condition to aspire to. Anything else is lesser. We've seen in this country, South Africa, where when anything happens to a white child, and they don't happen very much, some disaster, everybody's concerned. But when it happens to a black child, it's a mere footnote. Mere footnote. We, in turn, the victims of that state of apartheid, have taken on some of the ways of our oppressors. Now, in Professor Zara's commentary, she commented about Arab states in the same way that there has been collusion and excuse. We find ways to distance ourselves from horrors when they happen elsewhere. Indeed, leading universities, when the issue arose of expressing solidarity, not much more, and condemning genocide from the Israeli government and their defense force, people used, well, what about Sudan, South Sudan? What about this place? What about that place? In that lies the ingredients for us excusing our own atrocities through direct and indirect condemnation of when that happens. The quest for true humanity that Steve Biko made quite famous in his short monograph is something that inspires this meeting. That quest, we're farther away than we've ever been in all our contexts. It brings me to the next point of apartheid occupation in Palestine, the cruelties. They are unmitigated killing. When you kill and attack children, you're killing a future. And the South African apartheid, crime against humanity. being a victim twice over of Desmond Tutu's chairing of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I can say from my personal experience, even in the worst moments of torture by the brutal security police and others, there wasn't, except for wanting to kill a few of us, there wasn't that complete agreement to obliterate an entire group, an entire ethnicity. Yes, they saw the majority in this country as a massive threat. And their abiding fear, Steve Biko wrote about fear is an important determinant in politics. Their abiding fear was, will you, if you succeed in your liberatory quest, not do to us what we have done to you? South Africa has proven in its 30 years of democracy that people have not turned against the oppressor. There's been an open arm approach, and often I call some reconciliatory approaches as bending over backwards. We've done it. That's given some sense or right from our former oppressors and exploiters that they can continue thinking, doing, and being oppressive in ways that they can pass muster, as long as it does not become openly one of those things that one can be charged with. The sheer brutality. I'm looking at in a piece I'm trying to do, what makes monsters? What makes a group become monsters who simply don't have it in them to think of anybody who does not fit into their narrow Procrustean bed of their knowledge and their desire. Think of the rest as less than human beings. So the answer comes from media influence. Social media plays a massive influence. And the media and the controllers of that media tend to have an agenda. And even when you see a black face reading the news and giving interviews or taking interviews, most of them are just tolerated, especially in this country. But if the anchor were not black, the views may get more accepted. You see, we have a craving for acceptance. Now, with Palestine, it's quite different because children have grown up in their othering, in their being othered, sorry. And there naturally has grown a resistance to physical, mental, social, and economic subjugation. Steve Biko was that spark that ignited the same open resistance to those conditions in the southern tip of the African continent. Here, we have yet to deepen and safeguard our understandings of what it means to be democratic, what it means to be tolerant, what it means to live with those who may not look like us, not speak like us, but who are fully human beings. There is simply no real attempt to build necessary bridges in a sea of tumultuous contestation, divisive rhetoric, and intolerance. I'll never forget Cyril Harris, the Reform rabbi in the early 90s in Johannesburg. I was giving some talk where there was a significant number of northern suburbs Jewish families. And he said to me, there isn't a word for forgive or forgiveness in Hebrew. Excuse me. So if you look at the construct of how people think, they think through their script and their language. And if there isn't a place for forgiving, firstly, oneself, and secondly, anybody you other, the division, the intolerance, the them and us mentality will continue. The need to work together to restore our common humanity is far from our horizon, because we are faced in our world with rampant racism, ethnicity, sexism, violence, poverty, hunger, unemployment, and corruption. There's more redundancy of human life in this technological era than ever before in history. And post-COVID, the them and us divide has increased. So the psyche of all of us in South Africa, some 30 years after the demise of formal apartheid, remains blighted by the mental subjugation of white as the aspirational standard, connoting excellence, superiority, and the epitome of desirability. The subordination of Black in all spheres of life, despite our majority demographic. And importantly, the insidious resurrection of non-white as the patently inferior name or appellation, clearly intended to diminish, to inferiorize, and to render effete and ineffectual as a coterminous appendage of white. That has struck at the core of the emerging intelligentsia. And it was expressed very well in the Rhodes Must Fall, the Fees Must Fall campaigns. Biko's ideas of psychological liberation as an essential precondition to physical freedom and unashamed assertion of Black humanity, pride, and selfhood are becoming and have become more alluring now than they may ever have been when we were igniting youth activism and ferment in the 1970s at the height of racist oppression. Let me state clearly, I can never describe myself as a negative, a nihil of somebody else. This reification process makes us things, chattel, to be defined in terms of what we are not would be profoundly inimical to my sense of self and my integrity. But such persons who are referred to as non-somebody else uncritically locate their entire raison d'etre externally to this very essence. There are many, many factors to be considered in this battle that's never been as blatant now as it's been since the world was in major conflict from the so-called Second World War. There's never been a period with more war, with more intolerance, and with people being divided against their own natural condition. Fear is still an important determinant in most of our politics, and shockingly in the academy, which ought to epitomize precepts of idealism and the need to explore and not limit one's mind. I'm reminded of what Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl said. Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. Are we as free as to be able to choose our own attitudes without reference to the pastor, to the rabbi, to the prime minister, to the president, or to some other crazy person spouting hate against some group out there? Somebody said, and it's very highly contested who said this, Auschwitz begins whenever someone looks at a slaughterhouse and thinks they're only animals. And we've had that demeaning, that diminishing, that reduction, that dehumanization of people to the status of a mere object. That is epistemic violence, which is perpetuated in our media and in all facets of our education and socialization, within and outside the home, within the recreational space and at work. Don't also forget that Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel talked of the divine retribution of memory. Yes, we should clearly recognize the horror of the Holocaust, but it's unconscionable to want to commit genocide in the third decade of the 21st century when everybody is looking and can follow it second by second. I'm also reminded that on the 14th of May, Herzl's influence resulted in David Ben-Gurion unilaterally declaring Israel as a state. The UN quickly supported it. And the rest, as you know, is history. What many of us in the southern tip of the African continent don't recognize, that less than 2 weeks later, on the 26th of May, 1948, the Milan Pact government came in, ushering in formal apartheid. What we need is for those who claim they're not denialists of their own acts of omission or commission to stand up and be counted, like some of these groups have done. Jews for Peace. They have had the usual, you're anti-Semitic, thrown at them. Dostoevsky was taken and was going to be hanged on the 22nd of December, 1840-something. And then all of a sudden, there was an announcement that you're free. He said, life is everywhere. Life is in us, ourselves, not outside. There will be people by my side, and to be a human being among people and to remain one forever, no matter what circumstances. Not to grow despondent and not to lose heart. That's what life is all about. That's its task. I've come to recognize that. The idea has entered my flesh and blood. The head that created lived the higher life of art, that recognized and grew accustomed to the higher demands of the spirit. That head has been cut from my shoulders, but they remain in me, a heart and the same flesh and blood that can also love and suffer and pity and remember. That's life too. That is where the real resilience of the human condition hits us all the time. How is it that Palestinians, from infants to elderly, manage to continue to survive? They are exemplars for all of us when we lapse into self-pity about our conditions, that they are still standing despite the carpet bombing, despite the horrors visited on them. Ultimately, also, we need those who are claiming that they don't support this huge murderous intent to stand up and say they don't support it, instead of countering it in the ways that people tend to do to justify their lack of compassion and seemingly wanting to be neutral. One cannot be neutral when fellow humanity is being impugned in front of our eyes. We hear the words they use, we see them butcher us. So we can deal with racism at a structural level, but unless the personal racism, sexism, and othering is dealt with openly and without rancor, we cannot be fully human beings. So the condition of racism for me is personal, very personal, and we must get over ourselves and stop the spread of this virus to realize the quest for our common humanity. I want to stop there lest I continue on this train and take up other people's times. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Seth Cooper. And now, just before I can go to Comrade Opangwenya, who is the respondent, you reminded me of things that people say all the time, and they say, if you don't heal the wounds of your past, you are likely to bleed into the future, which almost sounds as though we are making excuses for people. And then I'm taken aback again to Paulo Freire, and where he says the oppressed, instead of striving for liberation, tend themselves to become oppressors. Liberation is thus a childbirth and a painful one. The oppressed want at any cost to resemble their oppressors. And what we are seeing in Palestine today truly mirrors this, and what we're seeing locally in the othering and the disregard of the rights of other people and the oppression of Black people and the othering of women, of members of the LGBTIAQ communities that almost just, goes unnoticed. Leads us to maybe the next conversation. Comrade Opangwenya, over to you.
Thank
Comrade
you.
Opangwenya. Oh, you were there. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Program Director, and let me thank our two keynote speakers for the evening. And let me also thank the UMTAPO and the university for providing us with this opportunity. It has never been so important for us to recognize how humanity has been depraved. It has also put a spotlight on international bodies that are supposed to take care of world peace and stability. The notes and remarks that we got from Professor Ali are very instructive and timely. One is that we should not look away. Two, we should not turn a deaf ear to the cries of others. Thirdly, we should not turn our back to the suffering of others. The infrastructure that women provide in this struggle, for me, was epitomized when George Floyd was lynched broad daylight by 3 policemen. It took a 17-year-old young girl, Daniela Frazier, to stay with the scene, even against extreme intimidation, to cover the death of George Floyd. It took 8 minutes and second. She just stood there. That, for me, confirms the need expressed by Professor Ali that we should not look away. We should not turn a deaf ear. We should not turn our backs to those who are suffering. In George Floyd, we've seen how Fraser picked up the fight. In as far as Professor Ali has shared with us what has happened in Iraq, it has brought it closer to say we live in a world where people who are prepared to kill this world assign for themselves the superiority that tells them that the world will be better without the rest. In their collective view, those that they undermine are human animals. Having dehumanized those people, it therefore doesn't matter what they do to them. The result, they believe, would have cleaned the world. The world will be cleaner and safer for them because they believe they are the chosen. The difficulty we're having today is that there isn't that spontaneous response to the plight of humanity as we would have expected. The academics are intimidated. The universities are silent. The media is colluding. NGOs that are supposed to be heard normally have decided to turn the other way. And hospitals that are supposed to be sanctuaries and no-go zone in areas of war are being bombed without remorse. Now, the saddest part, which is what I think the University of KwaZulu-Natal is trying to do, is to reclaim the space for people to think, to pause and reflect and reclaim the academic independence to see things for what they are. The greatest threat to that courage will be the donor community. We have seen in the US where universities stand up, the university staff is intimidated, the donors threaten to withdraw their funding, and for fear of losing the funding, those who are speaking out are then sacrificed or ordered to resign from their posts. But with voices like, and the events like this at UKZN and Professor Ali, we are called upon to say, it is not time yet to give up. It is also surprising that with the amount of journalists dying in Gaza, who are now more than 150, journalists even fear those who are in the profession to even say we are dying. They don't see, or they are intimidated to have a sense of collective outrage to the people who are in the same profession and dying in Gaza. So the space is really narrowing and getting smaller and smaller. And it is occasions such as this that are shocking us into reality, that by the time we leave it to others, we would have no space to stand on and to speak. In as far as the epistemic battle that Professor Ali talks about, I can also draw the same similarities here at home. In 1960, when the Sharpeville massacre happened, we knew that it was a massacre. But the world, surprisingly, took 16 years to arrive formally at declaring apartheid a crime against humanity from 1960. Only in 1976 did the formal resolution be adopted. This indicates that the world system and the institutions you are trusting do not see the agency in response to defense of human life. It is more legalistic, it is more lobbying, and up until there is consensus amongst those who are supposed to protect humanity, are driven to a point where it can no longer be defendable. It's only then that people are pushed to adopt resolutions that are responsive to the situation. In Gaza, we understand this year that there has been a convention against genocide. And for all these years, the genocide has been happening until South Africa put its best foot forward to lay a case with the ICJ. What would have happened had South Africa not taken the stance? And it's also up to South Africa to be exposed to the risks of the people who are behind the genocide, but turning the reality on its head as though they themselves are the victims. It makes and imposes so much doubt on reality and truth. You end up not knowing whether society has a sense of its own acceptance that it can never be human for as long as the situation lasts. Our mind have been reminded by Professor Cooper that we need to reclaim our minds. We can never be critical to think if our minds have been surrendered to those who are manipulating us. In the US, the most propagandized society, people can no longer even believe whether truth is truth, whether facts can be relied upon. The events are hardly a matter of concern to the rulers of our governments in the West, but the message is coming through and through from ordinary people, ordinary citizens of those governments that are unmoved by what is happening in Gaza. Never before has even the most propagandized society like America stood in the manner it has, as demonstrated in the streets that are occupied by the protesters. We are at a point where we either give in or we stay the course. We are also reminded by Professor Cooper that we should not rank pain. Pain is pain wherever it is experienced. So if it is Gaza, if it is Sudan, if it is the DRC, we should recognize that humanity is under siege and under threat. Most importantly for us, we need to reclaim our voice. We need to reclaim our visibility, because without a voice and being heard, the good causes upon which we stand will be overshadowed and forgotten with. With these remarks, I hope I've tried to bring a fusion between what we got from Professor Ali and Professor Cooper. The last point I want to make is that we have been betrayed by what we're made to believe is the watchdog of society, the media. The media has colluded. The media has hidden the truth. The media has followed power. And in following power, I think it will enjoy the association until things turn against the media itself, and they'll be the first to say blue matter when they were the ones who threw themselves in the loving arms of power and intransigent authorities. Chair, can I leave it at this point, and we'll see how we proceed with your guidance.
Thank you so much for those words. We dare not look away, and we dare not turn our backs at the oppression that we see. I do have some time to accommodate a few questions, and there is a question that is directed to all of the panelists, and this one is asking, what role can academia play in addressing conflicts like those in Iraq and Palestine? I'll start with Professor Zara.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you, Professor Cooper. It was really, really inspiring. Thank you also, Upa. Thank you very much for all your comments. I really learned a lot, and I appreciated everything that has been said so far. Well, it's a big question, and in a couple of couple of minutes, it's very difficult to answer it. But I would say that for me, academia plays a central role because I mean, probably most of you are also familiar with the notion of Orientalism. And more generally now, I think that there are more critical voices, even within hegemonic academic spaces, that talk about decoloniality. And I think this is kind of, for me, the future, and this is what I'm kind of doing also in Iraq and in my work, which is to provincialize hegemonic Western knowledge, because it is framed by whiteness, because it is centering the experiences, the subjectivities of white, middle-class, neoliberal, capitalist experience, right? So I think that, and there is a lot that we see, and all of you mentioned it in your presentation and comment. There's a lot that we see in the impossibility for people to identify or to humanize Palestinians and Iraqis until today. I mean, we are 20 years after the invasion, and I actually, last year, I organized a series of talks and conferences and a whole tour about to commemorate the 20 years since the occupation of Iraq in the US. And I realized that 20 years after 9/11, people in the US cannot see Iraqis as true human beings, basically. And so in my work, and in the work that many of us are doing, and I insist very much on feminist scholarship, because I do think that countering the discourse on gender and sexuality in the Middle East, the very racist Orientalist discourse, is here very central. Answering and questioning white feminism is very central. So in our work, what we're trying to do is to center the experiences, the subjectivities of those that are not considered truly human by hegemonic media, by hegemonic scholarship, right? So I think that that's really what we are collectively trying to do. And also, because there's an emotional thing. I think Professor Cooper talked about also, like the psychology of emotions, how people spontaneously identify with certain people and how they don't identify with others. Right. And I think that now is the time actually to do our work as professors, as activists, to push for an identification with the Palestinians, with the Sudanese, with the Congolese, with people in Haiti as well. I mean, there's a lot going on in the world. And I'll just say something quickly about the relationship, the necessity of this convergence of struggles. You know, I think it's Professor Cooper who said, like, a lot of people have been also, and actually Zionists use that argument a lot. This what I would call the whataboutism, like, oh, you care so much about Palestine, what about Congo, what about Sudan, why are you so sad? And actually, what I've realized in the streets of protest, and also as an Iraqi, I have been contacted a lot since October 7th because people who are getting involved in the solidarity with Palestine movement are now actually curious to talk about Iraq, to talk about Sudan, to talk about Congo. I think that actually within this movement that is emerging in the world, in the US and in the world, convergences are happening. So it is a very powerful answer to this kind of Zionist propaganda. And I'll stop here. And I have to say that actually I will have to leave at 7 because it's 1 o'clock in New York, and I have a meeting after this one, so I apologize. But thank you so much for having me and for this beautiful webinar.
Thank you so much, Professor Zara. And I'll quickly go to Professor Stats Cooper to try and answer the same question. But also, whilst you were at it, there's another question that says, you touched upon the notion of common humanity and the necessity to address personal biases to achieve true equality. What specific steps do you believe are essential in creating a more inclusive and tolerant society? Professor Stats Cooper.
I just want to round off on the first issue and point out that 3 female presidents were of universities, vice chancellors in our context, were hauled before Congress. The president of the University of Philadelphia, I think, Harvard, and MIT. All 3 were female. Yet there were male presidents who said things about the war that Israel was conducting in Gaza. However, the 3 women get hauled before Congress. It tells us how sexism plays itself out in the ways we least expect. And of course, those 2 of those left office. So coming to the specific issue, I think that university is a place where ideas should be contested. It's not a place for limiting freedom of speech. And it's probably the only time in your teenagehood and early 20s that you will have the degree of freedom you have as students. And whatever that view is, from far left to far right, those must be expressed. What is really shameful is that the academy, with a few notable individuals and a few notable universities, refuse to take a stance on what is happening. And that should tell us the low level of intellectual contestation, 1. 2, the fear that's apparent in those institutions, because young scholars, people in mid-career, will state what they feel and then be afraid to take the matters further, because those who are responsible for their continuing tenor and upward trajectory are going to mark them. The same thing happened during apartheid. We are repeating it now, willfully ignoring the charters of each of our public institutions paid for by taxpayers' money. You should have seen how ordinary people, taxi drivers, were talking about what happened at the ICJ. There was a sense of pride for South Africa's doing that. Yet we'll have others who will be taken on trips by the Zionists and proclaim whatever excuse they want to make. You see, murder is murder, whoever does it. So you cannot say Hamas is like this, therefore we will do that. There has to be a morally higher bar than to react and retort in that way. Well, what about them doing this? The issues of common humanity and social and making our children, enabling them to experience being truly human equal, no more, no less than anybody else, has to start in early exposure to education within the kindergarten, grade R, and so on, as we call it here. In Russia, you cannot teach in a kindergarten unless you've got a master's, especially understanding developmental and other issues. So we throw our children into the gogo around the corner who's going to take care of our kids. And she does a remarkable job with so little. However, what are we doing to that generation of children if we stunt them? And all the studies coming out now suggest that with hunger and without nutrition, stunting is becoming a big issue. So how do we do it? We must recognize our being the same. Ons is dieselfde. Siafana nje. Terence Sibisi. We have to recognize that it's only somebody's descriptor and categorization that wants to make us different. And some of us play into that very well. That thing about we weren't white enough before, now we're not black enough, all sorts of rubbish. And as we're going to May 29, it's going to be crazy season. So I believe that, and I don't know if groups like Mtapo still do their intervention in schools, in primary and early high school, but that's your antidote to narrow nationalism, narrow beliefs, bigotry of all kinds being sprung on our children. Because children are like blotters. They blot up everything in their environment, often getting confused by it. And that's why they need that adult guidance on this is a cartoon. It's not real life, for instance. So I believe that our education system needs to be completely changed. It needs to be transformed. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to teach us. And you cannot teach it if you don't believe it, that we are the same, that we are all human beings. We have a plethora of languages. We have a plethora of ethnicities, a plethora of beliefs, religious, political, social, and economic. All those are fair for us to engage in, not in the limited way, replicating apartheid in many forms all over the show, and especially in our academia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Cooper. And I just have to say, I'm so glad that you actually mentioned some of the work carried out by Mtapo to actually try and realize this humanity, this society that we envisage. I know I'm aware of the Weekend Campus program where they talk to gender-based violence, child abuse at schools. It's called the Peace and Human Rights Education and Anti-Racism Program in the schools. And this program really takes to the heart of ensuring that we can, we can actually inculcate these beliefs on our children whilst they are still young. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into that. I just want to quickly say thank you so much to everybody who was able to join us this evening. Thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you so much to the people of UKZN, Ms. Norma Zondo, the Executive Director and Corporate Affairs of UKZN, for always making the webinars possible. Thank you so, so much. Pamela Adams from UKZN for hosting us. Thank you to Dina Solia and the team at Trintapo and all the participants who actually logged in today to be a part of this webinar. It will be on the UKZN website. So even post this, you will be able to go onto the UKZN website and be able to access the link. And I think all of the people that were registered, an email can be sent to you with the link to make sure that you are able to view it and share it with other people. It's important information. So thank you so, so much for making the time to spend this evening with us and to listen to us. Professor Cooper, Professor Zara, as well as Comrade Opa. Thank you so much for sharing your insights so that I do not keep you for much longer. Have yourself a fantastic evening. And indeed, the struggle continues. Indeed, a luta continua. It is up to us to ensure that we can realize Steve Biko's vision to give to the world a more human face. Amandla, and good evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
Take care.
You. Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Sure.
Thank you, everybody. It was a wonderful webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.